Licenses, the cornerstone of the gaming industry. Whether a publisher is too lazy to come up with their own ideas or just wants to piggyback off someone else's success, love them or loathe them, licensed games have less chance of getting re-releases than Peter Molyneux has of winning a misleading advertising lawsuit. However, sometimes a game will start out as a licensed property, but for whatever reason will have it stripped halfway through development, inevitably evolving into a whole new IP. And you wouldn't believe some of the massive games out there that started this way. So this episode is dedicated to those lost licenses, those annulled authorizations, and those destroyed dispensations. As I say, but hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I'll welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 famous games that were almost licenses. Games don't get much bigger, or more brutal come to think of it, than with good old Doom. When it came out in 1993, Doom blew everyone away. There hadn't been a game like it, with the atmosphere, the first-person view, and the endless enemies. I mean, after all, it sure wasn't your dad's 3D monster maze on the ZX81. Doom was a phenomenon, and one of the reasons why after years of gawping at the prices of PCs in magazines, people finally caved in and bought them in their thousands. But the road to making this load of demon-based boomstick blasting fun wasn't altogether straightforward. After the success of the My Liebentastic Wolfenstein 3D and its retail sequel Spear of Destiny, work immediately started on another shooter using the same 3D engine. The cutesy Commander Keen platform games that id had initially become famous for were no longer of interest to Carmack and company, so naturally their thoughts turned towards Aliens, a movie that just about everyone at id loved. It's got big guns, lots of monsters, and lots of dark locations. A perfect premise for the entity-slaying shooter that they wanted to create. So, id Software started off negotiations with 20th Century Fox for the Aliens license. But, according to John Romero, the deal broke down at the last minute when it became clear to id that Fox refused to give them total creative control over the license, which was a deal breaker for them. However, Aliens would still have a big influence over the project. After negotiations had ceased, John Carmack suggested to the team that they should make an Aliens game, only with Hellspawn instead of Xenomorphs. And so the premise for Doom was born. Alas, there is no evidence of aliens inside of Doom's code. All the negotiations happened before development truly started on the game. However, the presence of the film will most certainly be in there for the final game, and when people started to mod the game, thoughts quickly turned to those xenomorphic pests. On November 3rd, 1994, a student named Justin Fisher released a total conversion mod for Doom, Aliens TC, probably one of the most important level packs, or WODs, in the game's history. So, even if Aliens had a small part to play in the story of Doom, its corrosive acid blood is still splattered all over it. As far as licensed games on the NES go, Sunsoft were one of the better studios around. At least for Batman and Gremlins 2. We'll forget about Fester's Quest. But one of their other efforts for the Little Grey Toaster came very close to being based on one of the best loved franchises of the 80s. Journey to Silius, or Wrathworld depending on what country you're in, had all you could want from an NES platformer. Outrageous difficulty, a pumping soundtrack, and it's not made by LJN. But on closer inspection, the first level is surprisingly reminiscent of a burnt-out Los Angeles circa 2029 AD. There's plenty of robotic enemies, including one that's quite a bit like a hunter-killer tank. And the game's final boss? Something called the Skeletal Android. Now, this sounds awfully familiar. I mean, what does it remind you of? If you said the Terminator, then give yourself a solid pat on the back. Score another one for Jimmy Cameron. It was well known at the time that Sunsoft were making a game based on the Terminator. Nintendo Power even reported on it, showing a couple of screenshots of the original game. And there's also code for a title screen and credits locked away inside of the cart. But it didn't happen. The reasons aren't totally clear. Rumour has it that with the upcoming release of Terminator 2, the rights holder at the time, Hemdale, saw dollar signs in her eyes and snatched the rights back in hope of a bigger publisher picking them up. Sunsoft tried to offer more money, but being financially squeezed from licensing Batman the year before, they had to reluctantly let go of Arnie's escapades. So as a result of this, there was a big rush to change all there was Terminator-esque about Journey to Silius, despite the fact they quite clearly missed a few bits. Thankfully, the original game came out without incident, unlike another Sunsoft project around this time called Sunman, which was meant to be a Superman game, which lost its license too, and then was cancelled entirely. And despite having Arnie's rubbery mug pulled from the game, Journey to Silius is now considered something of a cult classic. And as for the Terminator license itself, well, LJN picked up the rights for the sequel, which came out and disappointed many in 1991. Mindscape ended up grabbing the original license and then gave us a complete pig's ear of a game out of it. So, karma's an 8-bit. Yeah, that pun did work better in my head. At the start of the 90s, French studio Delphine became famous for their heavily atmospheric and cinematic games like Another World and Cruise for a Corpse. They already sort of had one licensed game under their belts, Operation Stealth, while a plain point-and-click adventure in Europe had a James Bond license slapped onto it by publishers US Golden Estates and rebranded it as James Bond The Stealth Affair. I think I'll have to make a note of that for a future episode. But US Gold were pretty happy with these guys' work so far, and decided to give them one of the most prestigious film licenses they had up their perjurous American sleeves, The Godfather. To a self-confessed cinema nut like designer Paul Casey, this was like catnip, and his mind raced as to just what he could do with this particular mob epic. Casey's idea was to do a game set in the Godfather universe, but way into the future, revolving around the concept of the Italian-American mafia still existing on an interplanetary scale. You do jobs for them, go on the run from them, all sorts. It sounded like an outrageous and original idea, and unfortunately it was a bit too original for US Gold, who were expecting something a little more down to earth. Excuse the pun. As a result of this, US Gold quickly rejected Delphine's idea for The Godfather and took the license off them. However, all was not lost. Delphine's Godfather game would take on another form and evolve into the hugely successful Flashback, a game that's filled with inspiration from a virtually endless array of films, proving that Paul Casey's Cinemania worked wonders. But as with Doom's Aliens connection, there's no hard evidence for The Godfather inside of Flashback's code. Some of the original idea's structure, such as taking jobs from the Mafia, are still present inside the final game, particularly in the second level on the surface of Titan. US Gold would eventually get a Godfather game thanks to Creative Materials, a 6-floppy behemoth that was only ever released on computers. The graphics for the game, by Pete Lyon, are an absolute work of art. The basic and rather repetitious side-scrolling shooter gameplay, however, is not. An interesting game, but hardly as exciting and groundbreaking as what Delphine had in mind. Compared to most of the other games on our list, Pax Corpus is probably the most obscure. It was released on the PS1 in 1997, courtesy of French developers Cryo Entertainment, was promoted as Tomb Raider in space, and its reception was generally meh. A fair few people might have forgot that this game even existed, which is a shame really, because it could have been so much more. Cryo Entertainment, at first, were obviously not making a generic game based on trying to emulate Lara Croft in spacesuits. They were actually making a licensed game based on the avant-garde science fiction animation Aeon Flux, a series of shorts and episodes that had caused a huge stir on MTV, starring the titular assassin of the same name. She could hop, skip, and snap necks like a good 'un. It was a perfect fit for a video game. The game itself was to be based on an episode called The Demiurge, but it all seemed straightforward enough. The game would be published by Viacom New Media, the games wing of Viacom, best known for publishing games of MTV's other animated hit, Beavis and Butthead. So considering Viacom also owned MTV, surely there couldn't be any trouble, right? Well, unfortunately, Viacom decided to close its new media company at the end of that year. It seems as though Beavis and Butthead games just weren't enough to keep it going. Control of Viacom New Media switched to another games company in the Viacom empire, Virgin Interactive, and they decided to cancel every project that was on the table, including the Aeon Flux game. There's even a tiny preview of the game that made it to TV, but it never made it to the shelves. At least not in this form. Cryo dusted themselves off, made plenty of changes, and eventually released the game as Pax Corpus later in that year. It's very Aeon Flux-like still, and there's several assets from the original game still in the code, along with snippets of text like, "We have to orient Aeon." But without any of the recognition that the Aeon Flux brand would have brought, the game didn't last all that long in the public memory, and quickly languished in bargain bins. Surprisingly, Pax Corpus wasn't the only attempt to make an Aeon Flux game. There was also a second attempt in 2000, although a lot less is known about this one. But this version was going to be developed by The Collective, and would have been a third-person affair using a similar engine to their successful Star Trek Deep Space Nine licensed game, The Fallen. However, the product disappeared very quickly, with barely any evidence left behind. As the game was going to be published by GT Interactive, one wonders if it was cancelled when Infogrames bought out GT in the middle of that year. But in 2005, an Aeon Flux game would finally make it to shelves. However, it would be based on the rubbish flop film starring Charlize Theron, and only loosely based on the animation. So when faced with such a typically mediocre licensed game as this one, they told the wrong title to flux off. And finally, our number one concerns one of the biggest RPG series around. Whenever the subject of Warcraft comes up, you can guarantee a few things. People are going to share stories of the thousands of hours they've lost to WoW. Someone's going to shout about the rubbishness of MMORPGs in general and blame the game for all the world's evils. And someone else is going to say that the game is just a total rip-off of various fantasy worlds and series that came before it. These are all severely flogged subjects. But the last one, however, does have a little bit of grounding in history. You see, Blizzard wasn't always a monolith. In the early 90s, there were a smallish studio by the name of Silicon and Synapse, who had gained notoriety for the likes of the most excellent rock and roll racing and the Lost Vikings. It was common for people to work on future games individually until big teams were required for them. And one project in particular was a strategy game being worked on by Patrick Wyatt since 1992, whom had been initially inspired by Westwood's Doom 2. However, it had gradually become more based in fantasy, with influences from the likes of Lord of the Rings, as well as Games Workshop's Warhammer. That game would be the original Warcraft. By the time 1994 rolls around, Warcraft was one of the company's main projects, and certainly a game with a lot of potential. But Warcraft was always a behind-the-scenes name for it. What were they going to do with it? Alan Hadham, co-founder and president, wanted to get in touch with Games Workshop and get the Warhammer license for the game, thinking, quite rightly, that the license would increase sales because it was such a recognisable brand. Naturally, he's got a lot of clout, you know, being the boss and all. However, virtually nobody else at Blizzard actually agreed with him, and weirdly, the reason for this had almost nothing to do with Games Workshop at all. You see, Blizzard at the time had been working with DC Comics on a couple of console games, The Death and Return of Superman, and probably the worst game they would ever produce, Justice League Task Force. These games are typical licensed fluff, not even remotely what they had envisioned, and are largely notable for the amount of soon-to-be industry greats credited on them, people like Chris Metzen and Mike Morhaime. Justice League was also where Blizzard started a relationship with the developers of the Mega Drive version of the game, Condor, whom would later pitch an idea to the rest of Blizzard for an obscure little dungeon crawling RPG by the name of Diablo. Don't know if you've heard of it. That aside, creating licensed games for DC had not been a good experience, and had soured most of the company from making licensed games for anyone else. In the end, while Alan still championed the idea, negotiations with Games Workshop for the Warhammer license fizzled out, partly due to the company's lack of enthusiasm, and partly due to Games Workshop's famous lack of flexibility on any point relating to their IPs. The rest of Blizzard also wanted the freedom to be able to do what they wished with Warcraft, which they obviously wouldn't have got if it was Warhammer. In hindsight, the deal falling through turned out to be the best thing that could possibly happen. One thing that is worth speculating on, mind, is one of the biggest mysteries in gaming. Warcraft is certainly inspired by Warhammer, and Games Workshop are litigious to the point that they sue people for simply using the words Space Marine in their books. So how come Games Workshop have never sued? They could have also had a case for StarCraft being simply inspired by Warhammer 40,000. But it's never happened, and no one knows exactly why. Whether Blizzard always changed just enough so that GW couldn't ever have a case, or if the companies have secret agreements with each other that we don't know about for the next 2 decades. We may never know. And what of Alan Adam? While his solution was based more on short-term sales than the big picture, he had the best interests of the company at heart and would remain there until 2004, when he quit Blizzard and the games industry altogether to go into the financial sector. In hindsight, he couldn't have chosen a worse time, considering he left just when Blizzard were about to release the first edition of World of Warcraft, taking the franchise to a level of popularity far beyond anyone's expectations. However, unlike recent subjects of Fact Hunt, this story has a happy ending. After 12 years out, Adam would make his triumphant return to the company in 2016, thankful to be working in games again.